Monster. Its definition is a frightening and hideous creature that produces harm with its appearance or actions. Ladies and gentlemen, the public has labeled an honest child something inhuman. Steve said it himself. He did not participate in the robbery. He was just creating a film for school. Steve is just a kid, a child with good character. Mr. Zawicki said that he was an honest and hard-working student, one of his best. Why would a kid with such great and noble qualities do such a thing? Here's the answer. He wouldn't. Steve is a victim of circumstance. It could have been you. Imagine yourself just innocently walking down the street, and then the next, being on trial for felony murder. The evidence the witnesses have brought to the stand to support Steve's innocence says it all. Steve Harmon is not guilty. Steve Harmon is not a monster. Steve Harmon is innocent. Saying that he participated in a monstrous act defines him as inhuman. However, ladies and gentlemen, Steve Harmon is not a monster. He is innocent. It is clear that Mr. Nesbitt is dead, but Steve didn't murder him. Steve didn't participate in the robbery, so why is Steve Harmon here? Boba testified that it was just him and James. Boba mentioned that James had it all figured out, but he could have just lied to save himself the trouble. If Steve honestly said that he did not participate in the robbery, there was no way that he was giving King or Evans any type of signal. James blamed an innocent kid. Mr. King said he had all under control, but in reality the whole plan was a mess. Bobo and James aren't friends with Steve, ladies and gentlemen. The evidence is obvious. Steve is innocent. Osvaldo Cruz's testimony mentions how he is afraid of Steve and how he is too young. However, Mr. Cruz hit his girlfriend and he was abusive. A little innocent kid who was supposedly forced into a crime wouldn't hurt a loved one. If Osvaldo is a little boy who did take part in a drugstore robbery, then why is he not being charged? Steve is a boy as well, a child who didn't even participate in the robbery. Ladies and gentlemen, this evidence shows how charging a 16-year-old boy for felony murder is unfair and injustice. Steve is scared too. Steve is just like any other 16-year-old boy. Putting a child in jail for a crime he didn't commit is immoral. Steve put himself on the stand and said no. No, he did not participate in the robbery. He said he was working on a project for his teacher, Mr. Zawicki, who was also called to the stand. Honest and one of my best students was the phrase that Mr. Zawicki said when he was brought to the stand. He confirmed that a project was assigned and that Steve was working on it. Steve is just a normal kid, framed for a crime he didn't commit. Think about your child or loved one, and imagine them in Steve's shoes. A confused, afraid, and vulnerable child is in front of you praying to get out of something they took no part in, an innocent victim. Monster is the last word you would ever use to describe Steve Harmon. The evidence that has been brought to the stand shows that words like honest, hardworking, and normal are used to describe Steve Harmon. He didn't participate in felony murder. He is innocent. He's a 16-year-old who was working on a project for school. He was framed by James King and was threatened to Osvaldo. Why would we dehumanize a normal teenager? Why are we degrading a child? The evidence that has been presented in this trial proves that Steve Harmon is innocent. Thank you.
A bullet through the lung and internal bleeding. Algonado Nesbitt lives his last moments of life, drowning in his own blood, fighting for survival. Working at the local drugstore, it was just an ordinary day for Mr. Nesbitt. Then tragic struck. Against his own will, Mr. Nesbitt reached for his gun for self-defense against Bobo Evans and possibly James King and other accessories including Steve Harmon and Osvaldo Cruz. According to Bobo Evans, James King grabbed the gun and shot Mr. Nesbitt, leaving a dead body lonely and helpless on the cold floor of his own drugstore. For the thieves attempting to rob the store, the murder that took place cost them their stolen money. But for Mr. Nesbitt, it cost him something more valuable than money, his own life. As stated by Bobo Evans' testimony, James King and him were both planning to rob the drugstore with the help of 16-year-old Steve Harmon and 14-year-old Osvaldo Cruz. James King promised Steve part of the money from the robbery if he would check to see if everything was clear. But after the murder went down, James and Bobo had to leave in a rush. Leaving the cash register open, several packages of cigarettes spread throughout the store, a gun left out that was said to belong to Mr. Nesbitt, and Mr. Nesbitt, dead on the floor. Poor or not, people are willing to do anything for a little extra money in their wallet, even kill an innocent person. Also, someone else was said to by Bobo that was very interesting. He was able to identify Steve Harmon and stated that he knows him from around town. But according to Steve Harmon, during his testimony that he doesn't recall ever having a conversation with Bobo Evans. So who do you believe? The person who will say or do anything to stay out of jail, or the person that is already in jail? The closest primary witness we have for this case is Laurel Henry. Henry says she was in Nesbitt's store on the 22nd of December buying cold medicine for her granddaughter. While she was in there, she hears men arguing about something and sees Mr. Nesbitt walk over to them. After that, she makes out, "Give me the money." But before anything got worse, Henry ran out of the store. Although she didn't see what happened after that, she was able to identify King in a lineup and at the testimony, the same person who was said to be the shooter of Mr. Nesbitt. With that said, these thieves are no fools. They had to make sure that Jose Delgado, who happens to be a black belt in karate, is out of the store. What better person to make sure the coast is clear than Steve Harmon? Osvaldo claims he was forced to be part of the crime, so he's untrustworthy to Bobo Evans. Bobo claims he knows Steve from around town, making him a perfect person to help accomplish the crime. But this crime did not go down without a fight. Bobo claims he saw Mr. Nesbitt grab his gun in the heat of the moment and move towards James King. Then, James King grabs the gun and shoots Mr. Nesbitt. Some might question if it was James King that shot the gun, because the wound found on Mr. Nesbitt was on the left side of his body, making the shooter most likely right-handed. And proven by Mr. Nipping, James is left-handed. But if you were going to shoot someone and fast, would you take the time to switch to your dominant hand for a better shot? Another person that made an appearance on the stand was Dorothy Moore. Dorothy said she received a visit on the 22nd of December by James King, her cousin. James was not known for showing up to his cousin's house frequently, and this took her by surprise, especially when he came bearing gifts. James arrived at Dorothy's house at around 3:30 with a lamp for her. But when Dorothy was asked if she still had the lamp, she claims it broke, so she had to throw it away. This had gotten rid of any proof that King was ever there. Dorothy also mentioned she didn't think King had a job at the time. So why would someone buy a lamp for a distant family member if they barely had money for themselves? Defense can stretch the story as much as they want, but you can't make up the facts in common sense. Steve Harmon and James King have been involved in gangs and bad crowds their whole life growing up on the poorer side of town. If the robbery was for money, for their family, or for themselves, it's still against the law, and there needs to be consequences for it. Because of their reckless behavior, a family is going to have one less family member to come home to every day. Thank you.